BioCentury This Week is brought to you by Jeito Capital, a leading global independent private equity fund with a patient benefit-driven approach aimed at financing and accelerating the development of groundbreaking medical innovation. Jeito's unique investment strategy combines significant capital and collective expertise to support companies and their management teams, ranging from clinical development to market access for cutting-edge innovations, with one main objective: go faster for the patient. Learn more at jeito.life.
Biopharma companies are aiming for higher quality weight loss. On the latest BioCentury This Week podcast, an analysis of the targets companies are pursuing to retain muscle while losing fat. Plus, Vinay Prasad's hiring by FDA as head of CBER, replacing Peter Marks, has rattled biotech investors. What do his past comments suggest about how he might change the bar for regulatory approvals at the agency? And the first in our series of what we're calling atlases, we take a look at vulnerabilities and predictive signatures in epithelial ovarian cancers. I'm Jeff Cranmer, and joining me today on the BioCentury podcast are my colleagues
Simone Fishburne, Editor-in-Chief.
Selena Koch, Executive Editor.
Stephen Hansen, Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
And Lauren Martz, Executive Director of Biopharma Intelligence.
All right, we have a full house today as we have a lot to talk about. Just a heads up, we have a special treat. It's our 25th BioEquity Europe conference. As always, it is sold out. We've got lots of great panels and presenting companies. And the special treat for podcast fans will be that Stephen and Simone will be wrapping up the key takeaways from BioEquity, hosting the podcast in Bruges on stage, and you'll get to hear a recording of that. Selena will be at the conference too. She is moderating the Pharma BD Roundtable. Stephen and Simone will be on a panel on how Europe can seize this moment among the uncertainty in the US. And then, of course, Simone will be kicking things off with the Scene Setter panel, which asks, what's next for European biotech? Can it raise to the complexity of the moment? And once you've finished digesting BioEquity Europe, why not head to Chicago for ASCO and then follow that up with a delicious dessert? Grand Rounds, BioCentury's R&D conference, which sits at the nexus of academia and industry. There are a few presenting company spots left. Reach out to me if you're interested. We're looking for innovative early stage companies to join what we like to call our Geekapalooza, where we let our nerd cred shine. Okay, let's get into some obesity. We just published a great story by Stephen that says, hey, incretin-based therapies dominate the obesity market today, but some companies are looking ahead to a future where the quality of weight loss matters as much as the quantity. Stephen, you took a closer look here. What did you find?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Yeah, so as you say, this is sort of, I guess I'd say sort of a continuation of a series that we've been looking at about sort of quality weight loss over quantity. You might recall earlier this year, we talked a fair bit about this when we sort of did our deep dive on amylin and obesity. And so this is kind of a continuation on that theme. So these are sort of new targets that either focus on preserving or building up lean mass while sort of also selectively burning fat mass. So what we focused on here were targets kind of within two signaling pathways. The one is the myostatin activin receptor 2 pathway, which is in skeletal muscle, or the inhibin ALK7 signaling pathway, which are in the liver and adipose tissue, sort of respectively. What I think is really sort of interesting about each of these targets is that there's human genetic data to support their selection in obesity, kind of right off the bat. So there are rare examples of beneficial loss of function mutations in myostatin, inhibin ALK7, where you have these individuals walking around that are healthy, they're leaner, they have displayed cardioprotective effects, they're less prone to type 2 diabetes, sort of all, have a narrower hip to waist ratio, these sorts of things. So there's lots of, good reasons for going after these targets. But, being selective and targeting fat alone or preserving lean mass, the other thing you have to keep in mind with these is that these targets are not going to be generating the same level of weight loss that you would get with the GLP-1 or the incretins, right? So those mechanisms where appetite suppression is kind of the primary kind of outcome, that results in weight loss that is both lean mass and fat mass. That's why you see these profound numbers, weight loss figures of more than 20%. With a mechanism where you're sort of exclusively targeting fat mass, and maybe in the case of like myostatin or some others, if you're even adding lean mass, those numbers are going to be much smaller. So, I think we have to have, our expectations have to be reined in here. You're not going to see one of these sort of competing with tirzepatide in terms of sort of the overall weight loss.
Stephen, do you think that makes these mechanisms suitable for different subsets of the patient population?
Yeah, I do. And I think that's where I think it'll be interesting to see how it kind of plays out. I mean, assuming that we see efficacy with these, obviously, I think it'll be interesting to see how these play out in terms of where they'll be used. I think there will be, I can foresee a scenario where there is maybe a subset of patients where monotherapy might be appropriate. You could envision a scenario where older individuals who maybe don't need to lose, 10% or more, maybe 8%, 7% is fine, but where preserving lean mass is the primary focus. You don't want to lose lean mass when you're like 65, 70 years old. So you could see a monotherapy in that setting, but I think primarily where they're going to be most used is either in combination or as a maintenance therapy. And maybe we can come back to that once we talk a little bit about the different therapies that are being developed, and especially the modalities, because I think the modalities is where it also kind of plays into it.
Yeah, maybe should we start on the myostatin activin side of the ledger, and you could tell us a little bit like what are the lead programs there?
Yep. Yeah, no, of course. So the lead programs, there's actually 3 sort of different programs that are in phase 2. And that was kind of the impetus kind of for doing the story in the first place, is we've got 2 programs that are expecting to read out very soon. So that have data coming this quarter. One of those is Lilly's bimagrumab, which is targeting the activin 2 receptor. Then you have Scholar Rock's myostatin inhibitor, which is also in phase 2, which has data this quarter. Myostatin being the ligand for the activin 2 receptor. So it'll be interesting to see whether they have similar data or whether there is a difference between the two, because myostatin is not the only ligand that targets the activin 2 receptor. There's also activin A. And so that's why the third phase 3 program that's out there, Regeneron, they've developed antibodies against both myostatin and activin A. And so they're kind of going for a more complete sort of blockade of both ligands. And so that's the COURAGE trial. Now that data is not coming until next year, but I had a couple people call out that that'll be a very telling trial to give us an idea as to, whether blocking both ligands is required, whether blocking the receptors better. There's different arguments around that. So I think it'll be interesting to see how the data reads out. The other thing to quickly note about these programs, though, for like Scholar Rock and for Lilly's molecule, these were not initially designed as obesity therapies. These were rare disease therapies. So they don't necessarily have the best profile that you would want for such a large indication like obesity.
Stephen, actually, that's where I wanted to go. That's interesting. I wanted to ask where these programs or assets are coming from. As Jeff alluded to, I am working on a scene setter looking at deals from Asia. So I'm all about deals at the moment. What I do notice is there's a fair few sort of starting to come from Asia, assets in obesity, and that they command slightly, towards the higher end of the deal value. So the question is sort of how many of these programs were homegrown, came out of academia? Have you got a sense of where the innovation is coming from?
So the first wave, it's still either pharma or sort of, more established biotech companies. So like the bimagrumab program that was originally developed at Novartis was then spun out into Versanis, which was then acquired by Lilly. But that was originally a small body myositis program. So it was looking at a muscle wasting sort of disease setting. Scholar Rock's program was developed for SMA and has seen positive phase 3 data with SMA, but then they obviously pivoted, moved it into obesity. It's still largely in those areas, but we are seeing sort of the next wave. And so this is also in the story, looking at some smaller biotechs or private companies that have now sort of looking to develop more optimized programs. So you have companies like Six Peaks, you have companies like iBio, where from the get-go, they're thinking about these targets with obesity as the primary setting. So they're looking to develop optimized PK profiles, subcutaneous dosing, long half-lives, to try and minimize the number of administrations that you'd have for patients. So that's kind of where the next sort of wave of therapies is coming, are ones where they're developing these molecules with obesity as the primary target in mind.
Let's talk about modality innovation. I think in the other side of the other major pathway you described, inhibin, there's kind of a range of modalities coming into play.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So inhibin and ALK7. So these ones are interesting because so inhibin is a gene that is primarily expressed in hepatocytes. And so, as I think most of our listeners will know, siRNA, sort of with the GalNAc sort of technology, primarily traffics to the liver, and so makes inhibin a pretty naturally attractive target for siRNAs. So you've got two companies there primarily doing it, or sort of leading the way, that have programs in the clinic. Wave Life Sciences and Arrowhead both have siRNA programs targeting inhibin. So inhibin expresses activin E, which then traffics to adipose tissue, and it goes with its receptor ALK7. So the challenge there, if you're going to use siRNA, is getting it to the adipose tissue. And so Arrowhead thinks that it has a new technology, effectively, where it can use a small molecule conjugate to direct the siRNA to specific tissue types. And so essentially, this is one of the programs that they're using to kind of test out that new modality, that new delivery technology. So, I think in their minds, it's a higher risk program, obviously, because you're not only combining a new target, biology with new delivery technology risks. So there's multiple risks kind of stacked there. In speaking with them, they also highlighted the fact that with ALK7, because you're taking out the receptor, and again, this is kind of similar to activin 2 in that there are multiple ligands to ALK7, with activin E being only one of them. And so they said that in preclinical studies, they saw nearly twice as much sort of fat mass loss with their ALK7 program as compared to inhibin E. So they think that there's the potential for greater efficacy with that, but it also comes at a higher sort of development risk, given what's happening there. Both those are in phase 1, and I think have data coming either later this year or early next year. So I think those will be really interesting to see how they come out on the human side. In particular, when we were saying earlier about where these therapies could potentially fall, I just find the siRNA ones really compelling, because when you look at dosing, Wave Life Sciences thinks that they've got a PK profile that could lead to every 6 months or even potentially once a year sort of dosing. And there's preclinical data that shows that after you give, mice GLP-1, you can give them the siRNA, and effectively it prevents any of that weight rebound that you see sort of post-incretin therapy. So you could really envision a situation where you either dose in combination, or you have a patient on an incretin, they get that initial weight loss down, and then you could transition them to an siRNA where every 6 months or every year, you just go in, you get your shot, and that basically helps you keep that weight off while preserving sort of any lean mass that you still have.
Yeah, that maintenance setting is probably pretty important. I think a lot of people do come off their GLP-1s at some point, and
That's right.
I've heard, at least anecdotally, that you tend to get almost more fat back than lean.
That's right. That's right.
So keeping that off seems like a priority.
Yeah, because that's sort of what's the picture that emerges, right? So you have this picture of people that go on a GLP-1, the weight comes off, but then you go off it due to whatever reason, if there's tolerability issues or whatever, that weight comes back, and it's usually more fat mass that comes back than lean mass. And so you have these situations where some patients are sort of cycling on and off therapy, and then you're losing more and more lean mass as you cycle. And so, I think these sorts of therapies could help sort of either break that cycle or essentially maintain that weight loss while preserving that lean mass. And I think that'll be a really interesting sort of product profile or opportunity for these types of therapies, in that setting.
All right. Thanks for that, Stephen. You can find Stephen's opus at biocenturypodcast.com or just on our website. I'll, of course, drop a link in the show notes. And while you're at it, why not hit the subscribe button? Leave us a review. We'd love to hear from you. And we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to head over to Washington to talk about the new head of CBER.
BioCentury This Week is brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Grand Rounds. BioCentury's R&D conference will return in 2025 to the US and Europe to debate key bottlenecks in translation and unlock scientific breakthroughs with commercial potential. Connect with VCs, academic innovators, and biopharma R&D and BD leaders to explore cutting-edge advancements in early-stage R&D as we dive into disease biology, therapeutic modalities, and enabling technologies. Join us in Chicago this June after ASCO for the second BioCentury Grand Rounds US, and in Cambridge, UK this September for the inaugural Grand Rounds Europe. Register and learn more at biocenturygrandrounds.com.
We're back on the BioCentury This Week podcast. Well, what can I tell you? It was an interesting week at FDA. Vinay Prasad's hiring as head of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, aka CBER, rattled biotech investors on Tuesday, knocking the XBI, that's biotech's most closely watched ETF, off 7%. As investors digested what the hiring of a fierce critic of some past FDA decisions to a top agency post would mean for industry. Stephen, you've been reaching out to some people on the buy side to get their thoughts. What have you been hearing?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So, originally when I was having these conversations, it was really didn't have anything, wasn't directly tied to this FDA, appointment. It was just in the wake of everything that's happening. There's all sorts of things that are going on. I just wanted to get a sense of kind of what their biggest concerns were. And it just so happened that Prasad's appointment sort of dovetailed with these conversations. And yeah, obviously the timing of it, I think, brought it to top of mind. But, I would say about half of the investors I spoke to, it was some form of either CBER or Prasad specifically named, or just more generally FDA, sort of turmoil at FDA, that are either their first or second biggest concern. I think this just highlights, how much it sort of weighs on their sort of investment decisions and how they think about sort of their companies, because obviously this is a sort of pan-industry sort of concern, right?
Yeah, so Stephen, let me jump in because I think it's Prasad's purview is, and Lauren is going to give us a little bit more depth in a minute, but his purview is, let's say, cell and gene therapies mostly, right, and vaccines for our industry. So the way I interpret what the investors are telling you is not necessarily specifically a cell and gene therapy play. Like those investors might be really worried or less worried depending on what they think about him, but more like the tone of the people that the administration is putting in these senior positions throughout
right.
FDA.
I think that's right.
And their stance being, Lauren, maybe you can tell us a little bit more, but it's, our job is to think about risks and how the industry should think about that. And, this is an individual who is, my understanding, Lauren, is that he's not, let's say, industry friendly. Is that a fair way of putting it? So maybe you want to sort of segue and tell us what we do know and don't know. But just to clarify, Stephen, I think that a lot of the uncertainty is around the tone and kind of things that we're hearing about FDA that investors are really worried about.
I think that's right. And just before I let Lauren jump in, to clarify, I think it's not only that and what you said about CBER and what they cover, but I think it's also now it raises the concern about, well, if this is who's named for CBER, who do they bring in at CDER? Who comes into that other position that has a greater oversight of more products that investors would be concerned about? Like anything, right? It's uncertainty. It raises the level of uncertainty, and investors hate uncertainty. And I think that's really what it boils down to.
Yeah, just for a little quick context, uncertainty, we had Peter Marks running CBER for a long time. He was ousted. And at CDER, we had Patrizia Cavazzoni, who was there for a good spell, and she stepped down on the last day of the Biden administration. Lauren, what's your take? You've been digging into his Substack writings and all manner of things to kind of get a grip on where he might go with raising the approval bar. If that's the case, what's your take?
Sure. So again, this is based on his public commentary before he had this appointment. This is the only context that we have at this time. I don't think it's a secret that Prasad has been outspoken against FDA. against the interactions between FDA and industry, about specific decisions, about specific trial designs and regulatory policies. But as Simone said, the exposure specifically would be for cell and gene therapy companies and companies developing vaccines. So looking into his commentary around those areas in particular, as you guys have mentioned, this risk aversion or sort of concerns about safety standards kind of underlies a lot of the commentary that we've seen from him. Over the years, we've seen a lot of the directors at different levels at FDA kind of breaking down some of the risk aversion that's historically been a big part of decision making. And so I think a concern is that this may be part of a broader effort to go in the opposite direction a little bit. Okay, so specific things that he's spoken out about. The accelerated approval pathway for cancer has been a big one. Within CBER, this will be most relevant to CAR T cell therapies, other cell therapy programs, and potentially things like personalized mRNA cancer vaccines. It's a limited number of programs. I don't think any of his commentary suggests that he is, against approving any of these modalities. I think it's a concern for the unknowns with the newer modality technologies and the safety and how that may play into moving CAR T cells into earlier lines of treatment, for example. There are some comments that these should be reserved for salvage therapy in certain applications. And the direction that the industry is going is toward earlier lines of treatment, toward more cancer types, solid tumors, and things like that. So I think that's one place that may give investors and industry some pause. Gene therapies, I think that there has been some broader talk at FDA to suggest that maybe there will be greater access to gene therapy pathways for rare diseases, which is something that was initiated under Peter Marks. I haven't seen anything to suggest that will not continue to be a priority. I think the bigger uncertainty is whether there's a line of sight for gene therapy developers to more prevalent indications. Again, this is a modality that doesn't have a ton of long-term safety data at this time, although there certainly is some. And, criticisms of programs like the Verve program for cholesterol lowering in a big prevalent indication. That's something that we've seen a lot of.
So with this, you're specifically thinking about like CRISPR-based or gene editing-based sort of modalities?
Well, so the Verve program is a CRISPR-based base editing therapy. So I think in general, there are a lot of, anyone who's concerned about genetic therapies probably is concerned about the long-term, off-target editing, all of that goes along with the CRISPR-based therapies. Of course, off-target editing and cuts are not really this concern for base editors. But I don't know the answer to where the line is drawn between gene editing, gene therapy. Obviously, gene therapy itself has had a ton of safety concerns over the years, and he's been pretty outspoken against the decision to approve Elevidys from Sarepta for DMD and the safety issues that have been associated with that as well.
Lauren, and we've talked about this. I know that other people have obviously, actually from both sides of the coin, had issues with the Sarepta approvals, some that it shouldn't have happened because the efficacy wasn't good enough, and some that the safety wasn't good enough. And I'm sure Sarepta would argue that both are fine. But I wanted to ask you to interpret, and, obviously he's scientifically qualified, and he's actually, I think, an epidemiologist by training. Do you think that we're looking at a greater bar than, like, what do people need to think about in terms of a greater bar for safety, a higher bar for safety, or an adverse environment? I'm not sure that it's an adverse environment. What are you thinking?
I don't actually know the answer to that. So, there's only so much data, safety data, that you can collect from a development program for a gene therapy like Elevidys. There were not huge safety red flags from the clinical data that was discussed and that publicly we saw for that program before it was granted accelerated approval. That was not a huge part of the conversation. It was whether or not this is something that would be effective for boys, because they wouldn't be able to have another gene therapy later based on the current state of the technology if something more effective came along. So I think that maybe my perception of some of the communications is that these technologies may need to be tested in indications that are small and rare and, where there are no other options to to create that body of long-term safety evidence to have confidence to move into a larger indication or an indication where efficacy may not be, entirely known. I'm really not sure, but that's one of the impressions that I've gotten.
Yeah, well, the FDA has certainly recently proposed creating a separate pathway for ultra rare diseases, right? But which would have its own kind of standards. So you could see maybe in the context of that, you can still advance gene therapies into the clinic. But the other possibility is that people working in those kind of medicines just have to do their early studies somewhere else.
It's true. And, development of gene and cell therapies especially gene therapies is difficult right now, incentivizing companies to do this. And without a clear pathway to a prevalent disease, it's the financial incentives. It's really difficult to envision this helping encourage investment into this space.
It just seems like the next chapter in a long saga of safety battles or swings in the stances on safety over time at FDA. It used to be a lot more conservative over there. And then through the years of all the patient-focused meetings and surveys, it just became really clear that if you ask patients, what kind of risk are you willing to take on for X amount of potential benefit, and you kind of like try to home in, patients are willing to take a lot more risk than the agency had been. And that kind of moved things toward a new direction. And, we don't know what's going to happen, of course, but there's a possibility, it seems, from what Lauren is saying, that the pendulum could swing back the other way.
Yeah, I mean, there's actually another thing that is a factor here. And you talked about doing your clinical studies elsewhere, which is, and we started out by talking about Europe and things, is that, there was this vision, certainly after Brexit in the UK with MHRA, they wanted drug developers to go and do their trials in Europe or in the UK, get their products approved there to get real world data on how they work. And then, so they weren't sort of pretending that it's instead of the US. They were like, this is a place where you can, we want to make it easy for you to get real world data on your therapies. And when I spoke to some people at FDA, they were like, yeah, that's like, this was back then. They were like, that's never going to happen because FDA really only likes stuff that it's approved. It doesn't care about real world data and so on. I wonder if that might change. I wonder if, the role of real world data might get more entrenched or more accepted, and there be different paths in the way that you've talked about, Lauren, for companies to move programs ahead and gather data that would satisfy regulators. Just a thought.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that either. I know that FDA has, before this year, been working towards greater incorporation of real world evidence in development programs and in reviews. So I hope it's a possibility.
Okay, let's take a step back from the world of politics and policy for now, and let's head over to our literature dive. Ovarian Cancer Atlases, 4 studies characterizing the molecular landscape of epithelial ovarian cancers describe molecular signatures that predict patient outcomes and highlight potential mechanisms of resistance and response to chemo and immunotherapy. This is a great piece in what may become a new series for us by our colleague Danielle Golovin. And Selena, you were one of the editors on it. Tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a fun new big project for us. So at BioCentury, we scan 27 journals every week looking for papers with translational relevance, generally new targets, new molecules, data and disease models that could spark drug development. But we noticed recently kind of an increasing number of papers that kind of present themselves as atlases. And these tend to be large-scale molecular profiling of human tissue or related to a human disease. And so we've been collecting these up. And we've got, just like in the last couple of years, over 400 of them. And Danielle's been sifting through them, looking for themes. And we kind of thought we'd kick this off by homing in on some underserved areas where if there were a better understanding of the biology or some predictive biomarkers, they could really, help unlock an area. And naturally, women's health bubbled up as one such area. And so her first project, Danielle's, was to just pull out the ones on women's health, and she found 4 on ovarian cancer. So we did those first. And basically, these large-scale profiling studies. If you look across them, one of the neat things you see is that all 4 of these atlases produced 1 or more signatures that can predict patient outcomes or stratify patients' subgroups. 2 are proteomic panels that can predict resistance, like standard chemotherapy. One is transcriptomic in nature, one a gene expression signature. Maybe the 2 big buckets are really characterizing resistance mechanisms and response to immunotherapies.
Selena, were there any biological pathways that were particularly interesting that came out of this?
Yeah, the DNA damage repair pathway came out in 2 of them. So one, looking at primary tumors, found homologous recombination repair downregulation was associated with sensitivity, whereas in relapse tumors, DDR gene upregulation predicted sensitivity. So kind of suggesting an evolving of biology over time with treatment progression. Tertiary lymphoid structures came out in another one as kind of predictive for response to checkpoint inhibitors, which is interesting. That's an area you've written about recently.
One of my favorites.
Yeah. And then another kind of theme that speaks to current trends was VEGF. So VEGF receptor 2 positive endothelial cells seem to be blocking anti-PD-1 responses, suggesting suppression could help remove that break. A lot of activity with a dual VEGF PD-1 right now, so probably there'll be people out there interested in looking at that one.
Excellent. Well, if you're interested, which I imagine many of our listeners are, women's health, of course, terribly underserved in our industry, which means a big opportunity for researchers and biotechs looking for the next new thing. Check this piece out by Danielle at biocenturypodcast.com or click the link in the show notes. And don't forget to check out our Grand Rounds conference coming up right after ASCO. It's in Chicago. It's in early June, biocenturygrandrounds.com. We're still looking for a couple of more presenting companies. The rate is a lot cheaper to present than our other conferences because we're trying to attract some of the younger companies that maybe have yet to find that one investor that's going to help bring them over the top and get their asset into the clinic. Thanks to my editorial colleagues for joining today. I enjoyed this discussion, and thanks to our production guru, Cole Travis. We will catch you next week. Stephen will be bringing you the podcast from beautiful Bruges, Belgium. And I'll be back in 2 weeks. Thank you to Kendall Square Orchestra for doing all of the music for our podcasts.
BioCentury would like to thank Jeito Capital for its continued support of our BioCentury This Week podcast and our 25th annual BioEquity Europe Conference this May in Bruges, Belgium.